There is a scene in Jojo's that I personally consider life-changing. It's something I haven't been able to stop thinking about since I first saw it almost a decade ago. Abbacchio is dead. He doesn't realize it quite yet, but he's currently in a liminal space, a place between heaven and earth where he will be forced to confront his deepest regret. You see, Abbacchio used to be a dirty cop. He started off as a young man with a strong sense of justice, but eventually had to face a cruel society that, at best, was indifferent to his efforts and, at worst, actively impeded him. And so, recognizing the futility of his ideals, Abbacchio took a bribe. After all, nobody seemingly cared. If he doesn't do it, somebody else will profit anyway. Why shouldn't he do what everyone else enables? If society is accepting of corruption, then surely there's nothing wrong with conforming, right? Wrong. As a direct result of his actions, another cop took a bullet for him, and everything came tumbling down. Abbacchio's bribe was exposed, he lost his job, and he became a miserable drunk riddled by guilt. Eventually, he had no other option but to join the Italian mob, where he was turned into a donut by a psychopathic twink. Now, before his soul can move on to the afterlife, Abbacchio finds himself eating at a restaurant when he sees a cop gathering evidence for a crime. On the surface, it looks pointless. The cop is inspecting a bin full of broken bottles, hoping to match one with the weapon used by the criminal. Upon hearing this, Abbacchio points out it's pretty unlikely to work, and even if the cop is successful, the justice system is so broken that, with a good enough lawyer, the criminal can easily go free. Why bother working so hard if it's just gonna end in failure? Abbacchio doesn't say it, but it's a question that's haunted him for the longest time. We've seen how he tried to be a good person, giving his best as a public servant, only to be constantly reminded of how pointless it was, until he just gave up. In a way, seeking the answer to this question has defined his entire adult life. The cop, however, says something that, lately and without any exaggeration, I still think about almost every day.
私は結果だけを求めてはいない。結果だけを求めていると、人は近道を従うものだ。近道したとき、真実を見失うかもしれない。やる気も次第に失せていく。大切なのは真実に向かおうとする意志だと思っている。向かおうとする意志さえあれば、たとえ今回は犯人が逃げたとしても、いつかはたどり着くだろう。向かっているわけだからな。違うかい？
Truth and justice are a process, not a result. If I had to sum up all of Jojo's into one sentence, that is the one thematic through line you can find across the entire story. Seriously, think about it for a moment. Every single protagonist is someone who is facing seemingly impossible odds, the type of challenge that an ordinary person couldn't even hope to overcome. And yet, despite this, they always remain firm in their convictions, and from their tenacity, victory seemingly comes out of nowhere. But it's never really out of nowhere. If you pay attention to the choices they make, they may appear trivial, but eventually add up to a significant result. My favorite example of this is Jonathan's first fight against Vampire Dio. I remember thinking the first time watching it that Jonathan had no chance of winning. Dio had just murdered a room full of cops, and Jonathan didn't have any special powers at that point, only guts and clever thinking. Little by little, though, Jonathan kept stacking things in his favor, like testing Dio's powers and setting the mansion on fire, until it resulted in Dio's defeat. And yes, you could argue he got lucky with the statue, but if he didn't even try, he wouldn't have gotten to that position in the first place. And that's really the message here. It's not about the result, it's about the process. It's not about what you get out of life, but how you live it. Jonathan's story may have ended in tragedy, but that doesn't mean his choice to be a good person was meaningless. His virtue was able to outlive him, influencing events that would ripple out for more than a century. Moving on to part 2, Joseph's victory over Cars is an even bigger example of this. Nobody can argue he didn't get incredibly lucky here. Even the narrator confirms it. But Joseph already knew how pointless it was. That's the point. For all intents and purposes, Cars had already won. And yet, Joseph kept fighting and struggling until an opportunity arose and he took full advantage of it.
この一瞬がジョジョの切断された腕に気を取られた一瞬がカーズの運命を分けた。避けられるはずの下からの着弾弾にさらに押し上げられた。
Mind you, at this point, Cars was supposed to be the perfect organism, the pinnacle of evolution. But the hubris that arose from attaining his goal blinded him to the possibility of defeat, and Joseph was able to distract him long enough for this to matter. Earlier in the story, Carsberry explicitly states what I'm discussing here. He doesn't care about the method, only about achieving ultimate victory. He manipulates his allies and betrays their memories as soon as it's convenient to him, revealing he never held much regard for them. To him, it was all about the pursuit of power. And yet, what did he have left after accomplishing this goal? His people were extinct. He didn't even have anyone to share his victory with. The only thing he could do was relish in his newfound power without any thought to what lay ahead. And so, his defeat is incredibly ironic since he now had nothing to do but think of how empty his future was for the rest of eternity. All of the main villains are similar in this regard. They're people who always think the ends justify the means, doing the most impulsive things for a short-term gain with no regard for the well-being of others. And this character flaw is usually what brings about their downfall. Dio, for example, is someone who always shortcuts his way to power. In the beginning, he lacked the patience and humility necessary to accomplish his goals in a constructive way. And so, he ended up in an even worse situation than if he had just waited. Seriously. Even after all the crap he did to Jonathan when they were kids, he was still a well-regarded member of the family. He could have been wildly successful on his own, and even if he failed, he would have inherited a sizable fortune once George died. Unfortunately, that wasn't good enough for Dio. He had already endured so much adversity in his youth that he couldn't bear the indignity of having to actually earn the status he desired. One could argue he was a victim of circumstance. I obviously don't agree with this, but let's see the other side of the coin here. You see, it's important to remember that Dio was raised in an environment that encouraged violence and selfishness. From a young age, he saw that the world only rewarded those who exerted their power and punished those who were too weak to fight back. This led to him implicitly accepting society's values and construct an identity out of them where he was destined for greatness at any cost. After all the abuse and trauma he went through, he needed it to be this way. The alternative would be to admit he wasn't any better than his father, only luckier. When he met the Joestars, this view was immediately challenged and it caused him to lash out. It actually explains why he hated Jonathan as soon as they met. He didn't see Jonathan's friendly attitude as a difference in opinion, but as an attack on his identity, one that he needed to establish dominance over in order to feel secure in himself. You see, respecting the inherent value of life was alien to Dio, something that only the privileged could afford to do. From his point of view, one can only be merciful if you hold power over a person. This was actually omitted in the anime, but there's a moment in the manga where George explains to Dio how Jonathan befriended his dog Danny. What makes it interesting is they didn't actually get along at first. Danny bit Jonathan when he tried to pet him, and Jonathan would throw rocks at him just to mess with him. Then one day, Jojo fell into a river and started to drown with no one around to help him. Danny, however, quickly jumped into the water and rescued the kid, saving his life. George then remarks that Danny didn't have a reason to save Jonathan. He had no duty or loyalty. He didn't even like the boy. And yet, he still did it. This is because even though he was a dog, he understood the inherent worth of a life. From then on, Jonathan and Danny would become friends, with Jojo never having to give orders to Danny for him to do anything. Instead, the dog would do things for him on his own, out of mutual respect. Needless to say, Dio was baffled by all of this. The idea that a pet owner, someone who wields power over a supposedly inferior creature, could treat said animal as an equal, and that this pet would then reciprocate it with mutual respect, well, it was something that didn't make sense under Dio's worldview. And so, instead of learning the right lesson from this, Dio burns the dog alive. This is a very interesting moment to me because, aside from the shock value, it very clearly says a lot about Dio's psychology. Yet again, we see this dynamic where Dio is shown something that challenges his identity, and he tries to prove it wrong through the use of force. Except, it never actually works in the long term. That's the whole point of the story. Jonathan held on to ideals and attracted allies that wanted to see him succeed, helping him every step of the way until he defeated Dio. And this was all accomplished by treating people with authenticity, kindness, and respect. From this core theme, Araki creates interesting parallels throughout the story that keep coming up. For example, in Part 3, Iggy goes through a character arc that's similar to Danny's relationship with Jonathan. They were both dogs with antisocial attitudes who eventually chose to help the protagonist because they were treated as equals. That said, I believe these themes are much more relevant in Part 5, where they're central to the story in a fundamental way. Giorno is literally Dio's son. In him, we can see a lot of his father's tendencies and even his old catchphrase. But he's also a Joestar, so there's an inherent nobility to his actions. More specifically, we get to see a synthesis of both philosophies in one individual. The drive to obtain results that he gets from Dio is also tempered by an emphasis on respecting the value of life, which ends up creating one of the most ambitious yet moral characters in all of the franchise. His stand power is to literally create life. The metaphor doesn't get much more obvious than that. Much like Dio, Giorno is someone who was raised in a violent environment. Instead of letting it influence him though, Giorno chooses to rebel against it, deciding to change it himself by becoming a righteous gangster. Anyone can spot the apparent contradiction in this. Gangsters are criminals. Everything they accomplish is done through coercion and violence. How could anyone be a good mobster? Well, reconciling this paradox is the main tension of the story. Many people criticize Giorno for being a little too perfect. I won't deny that, in comparison to other Joestars, he comes across as a bit bland, but I don't think it's completely fair to write him off as boring. The fact that he's a little too perfect actually plays into his character arc. It's just more subtle than in other parts, so it's easy to overlook if you're not paying attention. If you go back and watch it, the biggest obstacle Giorno often faces is not from his enemies, but rather from his allies. They often distrust him and argue in the middle of a battle, which just complicates things for everyone. This doesn't come out of nowhere though. It's a core theme manifesting itself from the same type of resentment Dio had when meeting Jonathan. Bucciarati's crew are all people who were failed by society, just like Dio. Their way of coping with this was by being violent assholes, just like Dio. And when they're introduced to someone who challenges this notion with mere aura, well, almost every character in the crew starts off resenting Giorno for just being himself. Not because they're necessarily opposed to his goals, but because they perceive it as an attack on their identity, and this miscommunication generates most of the friction in this story. The common denominator here is that every member of the crew has allowed society to define them. When Giorno is challenging these values, he is also indirectly challenging their identities. Giorno's main goal then isn't to defeat enemy stand users. That's a secondary objective and usually the easy part. His real struggle is to both understand and be understood by the rest of the crew. We can actually see this play out in a lot of the fights. For example, the boat fight required Giorno to sacrifice himself so that Abbacchio could figure everything out. And the fight in Pompeii also had a mirror dynamic. Another blatant example is when Narancia had an entire encounter where he was saying the opposite of what he meant. The chaos that ensued from such a simple ability really hammers home the point of communication, and Giorno's ability to understand Narancia is what ultimately allowed them to succeed. This is when Narancia starts to see Giorno for who he really is, reflecting on it at the end of the battle. Even the final confrontation against Diavolo rested on the fact that they had all switched bodies and couldn't trust who they were. What I love the most about this is that it's all set up from the very first stand battle, almost like a microcosm of what is to follow. Bruno initially thinks Giorno is just a murderer, but over the course of their fight, they get to understand each other, and Giorno realizes Bruno is a kindred spirit, with both of them choosing to not deal a finishing blow at a critical moment. This is because they both value doing things the right way. It's not perfect though. Even after accepting him, Bruno is still not fully committed to Giorno's goal. He brings him into the gang, but clearly states that he won't help him if he gets caught, so there's still some lingering resentment on his part. As the story progresses, we then get to see this subtle change in Bruno where he's no longer suspicious of Giorno, and actively joins him when they first confront Diavolo. Every member of the crew goes through a similar character arc, culminating in their decision to betray their organization. The one I feel most relevant, however, is Abbacchio's. Again, just like Dio meeting Jonathan, Abbacchio feels the need to establish dominance over Giorno as soon as they meet, and he's constantly irritated by his general attitude. The reason behind this resentment is that Giorno reminds Abbacchio of everything he isn't. Giorno chose to be a gangster. Abbacchio saw it as a last resort. Giorno is defiant and does whatever he feels is right. Abbacchio always follows orders and values authority. And yet, when the moment of truth arrives, Abbacchio is the first person to jump on the boat. This scene in particular is one of the most important moments in the story. It's the emotional turning point where the crew finally has to choose what type of person they want to be. According to society, being a gangster means you're scum, and they've already made peace with that. But being a traitor makes you even worse than scum, and so they're all confronted with the ultimate test of their identities. Will they let society define them, or will they choose to carve it out for themselves? Not all of them step on the boat, and the ones who do, well, most of them wind up dead. But that's not really the point. Quite the opposite, actually. What matters is they made the choice knowing full well this could be the result. Remember how I mentioned back in part 1, Jonathan didn't have to give any orders to Danny, who acted of his own volition, how their relationship wasn't master-servant, but one of mutual respect? Well, here we get to see the same concept in a more powerful way. Bruno is very honest about the stakes. He won't order any of them to join him. They have to decide for themselves. I find this really meaningful because it highlights how Bruno never treated them like expendable minions. They were equals, and although he never expected anything in return, they rewarded his leadership by joining his mission. They may not realize it, but they're finally on the same page as Giorno, even if they think they're only following Bucciarati, valuing the method above results. Their opposition to Diavolo actually mirrors how he manages his entire organization, with La Squadra being the exact opposite of Bucciarati's crew. These are cold assassins who don't really have any loyalty to one another. They are forced to work together out of mutual self-interest, not because they like each other, but because they see it as either the way to make the most money or the only way to survive. Diavolo used force and coercion to keep them in line, and it worked, for a time. The second they didn't have to, they immediately turned on the boss. The clash between them and Bucciarati's crew then reveals the true meaning of the story. They both wanted to achieve the same result, killing Diavolo, but the methods they each utilized are what ultimately made the difference. La Squadra was very individualistic. Even when they worked together, they had a contentious relationship that didn't lead to true cooperation, with the stronger members often hurling abuse at the weaker ones. When La Squadra was closest to achieving their goal, Risotto had to fight Diavolo alone, and died because of it. Meanwhile, every time Bucciarati's crew is fighting him, they're all doing it as a group. It's something that keeps frustrating Diavolo because his ability is more suited to killing people with a surprise attack. Ultimately, Bucciarati's crew is simply more comfortable relying on each other. They might bicker, but it comes from a place of friendship rather than contempt. This is all due to the fact that they're all following Bucciarati, who keeps them aligned under his leadership. A big part of Bucciarati's character is that he always chooses the most honorable course of action. We're shown he acted this way even as a kid. He's a person who values methods above results, and that's exactly why the rest of the crew respects him so much, to the point where it influences their behavior even when they don't realize it. When they become traitors, Abbacchio is the one who comes closest to verbalizing this. He joins Bucciarati because the only time he feels inner calm is when he's by his side. The reason for this is simple. Abbacchio just doesn't trust himself to do the right thing anymore. This type of self-loathing is then transferred to Giorno, who reminds him of the type of person he failed to be. The tragedy, of course, is that he dies soon after he starts changing himself. And so, at the end of his life, he needs to confront his self-hatred before he can move on. Abbacchio starts breaking down when he understands what's going on. He realizes that the person he was speaking to was the cop he got killed, and that they were both actually dead. His first instinct is to get back to the crew, feeling he hadn't done enough for them, but it's too late. The cop, however, is quick to put him at ease. Even after all of his mistakes, and despite his quick and unexpected death, Abbacchio's actions weren't meaningless. Choosing the process above the results did make a difference. This is what makes the moment so powerful. Abbacchio finally realized he didn't have to be perfect, he just needed to keep doing his best. It's a message that says, no matter how far gone you might think you are, it's never too late to do the right thing. This is the closest we're ever gonna get to Rocky making a thesis statement on his art. You can find these themes at the heart of every conflict he writes. It's even hidden in the small details of the story, like the villains usually going for an instant kill, while the heroes favor going for a beatdown. Even in something trivial like this, we can see how the process of beating someone up is far more rewarding than actually killing them. Now, I'm not saying Rocky has consciously planned everything to have some hidden meaning. This is just my take on the story after all. I just find it interesting how consistently, for nearly 30 years, these ideas keep coming up in his art. Almost like it's a reflection of what he truly values. Even if everyone around you is a piece of shit, even if it ends in complete failure, and even if it feels like the universe itself is standing in your way, it's still your moral duty to respect the value of life, which includes both the impact you have on others and how you treat yourself. And so, dear viewer, I ask you to really think about everything I've said. Not many people are gonna make it to the end of the video, so if you stuck around, I hope it's because something about it resonated with you. I know I need a reminder every once in a while. Thank you for watching, and remember to enjoy the little detours. Until next time.